centre of such exotic creatures as Edna Everage and Les Patterson. According to the art critic Robert Hughes, Barry Humphries is Australia's only true Dadaist. Now, there's always something unnerving about interviewing a consummate performer, especially one who plays with an audience as mercilessly as Barry Humphries does. Seen in one light, his whole life seems a series of performances: the precocious rebel without a cause in suburban 50s Melbourne, the Aussie in London in the 60s, mixing uneasily with the English wits of Private Eye, the life of fame that the success of Edna Everage brought him in the 70s in London, and this isn't to mention his other lives as writer, painter, bibliophile, and expert on late 19th century music, art and culture. An Australian Orson Welles is another well-known description of Barry Humphries, one way at least of trying to express the man's restless energy and ambition. Of course, Barry Humphries is funnier than Orson Welles.
Dame Edna, is it an appropriate moment to ask you about your relationship with Barry Humphries?
Thank you, security.
Was it a Bible story that first brought you together?
There's always, I think, traditionally, if I may be a little bit historicist here in the simplistic sense, per se, been a tension between the impresario and the artist, or the artiste in my case. I mean, look at the quarrels that Diaghilev, that lovely old choreographer of the olden days, had with Nijinsky and Pavlova, his two principal ballerinas. They were squabbling like cat and dog most of the time, and I think the reason is that impresarios wish, indeed, they were up on stage with the lights and the adulation and the applause, and I think Barry sometimes feels very, very bitter. I hope he's not going to see this. But you see, he's trussed me up like a chicken in his contract. Trussed me up like a blessed chicken.
So is he a lonely man, I wondered, living in the shadow of all his more famous characters? There's a hint of this in a story he tells in his new autobiography, My Life as Me, about his haunting Czech cafes as a teenager in Melbourne.
I don't think of myself as a lonely figure. More recently, I've, of course, engaged the audience to such an extent that you could say that my shows have the largest cast in town. The entire stalls are my support act. But I always did feel rather isolated. Certainly being brought up in Melbourne and feeling that I somehow belonged elsewhere, especially when my parents were fond of saying very loudly in my presence, "We don't know where Barry came from." It's a bit worrying, really, especially when there's a nice little girl up the street who was adopted, you see, and you're told, well, don't tell Valerie, but she's adopted, you know, Barry. And I thought, well, is there something they haven't told me? So when, as a student, I went into these cafes in Melbourne, which harboured refugees, Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, I felt at home amongst these displaced figures. The smells of their cigarettes, you know, the taste of the food, the incomprehensible language. I guess I am fantasized, really, about being Central European. And so I often go to Central Europe and wander around these cities.
And what is it that draws you to that imaginary space?
I sometimes think it may be I might have even existed there in some former life. I may be trespassing on Edna territory here.
Yes, I was going to say that. I mean, but was it the smell of cigars? Was it literature? Was it Kafka?
Often it's literature and music. And I always very much liked the music of Central Europe and the music of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And still do, really. It's my favourite music. And I just feel more comfortable in that part of the world.
We've been talking to Rabbi John Levi,
really?
Who was an old friend of
yours. But he's in Melbourne.
Yes, we can do that on the radio.
Oh,
it's very
yes.
clever. And we've talked to him about what you were like in your school days.
Australia, particularly at those days, was adrift because we knew that the mother country had abandoned us in the Second World War, and nothing was changing here. All our men had been away in the war, and the place was frozen. We went to a school that actually pretended to be a British public school with uniforms and all sorts of things. And everything that was real was happening in England. And we were a sort of castaway on an island. It was built with the same stones as the main prison in Melbourne, about the same era, built in the 1850s, 60s. Big blue stone walls, very uncomfortable. And we all had to wear the most terrible blue uniform to prepare us for business suits when we grew up. It really was like prison. And Barry rebelled by doing everything wrong. We had to have short haircuts, so he refused to have his hair cut. And then Barry refused to be part of the cadet corps, which I certainly didn't have the courage to do. And the cadet uniform, by the way, was bizarre. It was a bit like the Beefeaters, except it was blue. And Barry refused to be part of it. So he became a conscientious objector long before we knew about conscientious objection. Then sport was a dominating factor. And so we had to watch matches. That also was marked. And in the Melbourne Cricket Ground, the great MCG, he arrived one day with knitting, sat behind the goalposts, turned his back to the field, and knitted. He was there, but not there. And he'd fulfilled his obligation. He was there, turned out, and stunned everybody. So this was a great performance. Probably one of the best he ever did.
Of course, John Levi, who was speaking about Melbourne Grammar, that stone prison in which we were all incarcerated, had the advantage, of course, of being Jewish and knowing what he wanted to be. Very few of my contemporaries at school knew exactly what they wanted to be when they grew up. But he knew from an early age that he wished to be a rabbi, and I rather envied this certainty that he had, and also the fact that he was a bona fide outsider. He had the advantage of being Jewish. He didn't have to go to chapel, for example, and sing those hymns, and smell all that brilliantine.
So Levi is a bona fide outsider.
Yes.
Humphries has to invent himself as an outsider. Levi's got a wonderful phrase. Humphries did everything wrong.
Well, yes, I went against the current. That's why, for example, when I discovered that marvellous book by Huysman,
Against Nature.
Against Nature, I thought it was a fabulously, well, apart from being very entertaining and also funny, especially funny. I don't think Huysman meant it to be funny, but it is pretty funny. I also thought that it was a Bible for me. And I saw myself as some decadent figure in some bejeweled salon with books bound in toad skin, that kind of thing. And especially when I discovered Holbrook Jackson's wonderful and still unsurpassed book about the 1890s, published, about 1914? Yeah, but I had it in the Pelican edition. And that was an immense turning point for me, so that I could look back at that period and then forward again to about 1916, when another explosion of creativity occurred in Zurich with the Dadaists. And with them I especially identified, and I tried to bring Dadaism to my life at school.
And also when you went to Melbourne University, where ostensibly you were reading law, philosophy and fine arts, you invented a Dadaist character, didn't you, called Dr. Azimuth?
Yes, Dr. Azimuth was a marvellous disguise for me. And he was a figure rather like Dr. Caligari or Dr. Mabuse. He was out of the German expressionist cinema. I was also on the Film Society at Melbourne University, and we didn't do a great deal except choose films which would be shown to the students. And I made sure that all of the films were of that period. Nosferatu and all of these movies were shown to uncomprehending, of course, university students at Melbourne who were studying dentistry and accountancy, as well as early surrealist films like The Seashell and The Clergyman, for example. It was fun sitting there enjoying these films and watching all the other students leave after about 10 minutes.
And was there a pleasure in watching everyone else live?
Oh, a great deal of pleasure in being the only one to enjoy it. And I still rather like to have books so limited indeed that I can be pretty sure that no more than about 3 people in the world own a copy.
So you remain, to use Levi's term, a conscientious objector. You like not loneliness, but aloneness.
Alone, perhaps that's true. That poem of Sassoon, Lone Heart Learning, by One Light Burning, always appealed to me, and I identified with it, as I did with Sassoon's autobiographies, with their evocation of an idyllic pre-First World War life in the countryside, forgetting about cricket, of course, and fox hunting. I managed to skip those rather long and tedious passages.
When you were at Melbourne and you were being Azimuth, you were a Dadaist in all kinds of ways. And there's a story in the autobiography, forgive me for asking you if it's true, because I know all stories and autobiographies are true, of course, which is when you used to pick up hitchhikers.
Yes, well, Dr. Azimuth, of course, wore a battered black Homburg, a wing collar, a dark coat, and a rather very pale makeup and black eyes. So it really was a monochromatic figure from the silent cinema. And I would disguise myself as Aaron Azimuth, while a friend of ours, Robert Nathan, actually a friend of John Levi's and mine, would drive. He was the only one of us with a license. And we would cruise around in his parents' car or in my mother's car. I don't know quite how we got hold of that. Late at night, and pick up couples trying to find their way home after parties or dances. Very often you would see a forlorn figure standing, making gestures with his thumb, and we would draw to a halt. I would be sitting in the front seat with the driver, and Robert would always say, "Where are you going?" And the couple would mention a district of Melbourne, and we would agree to take them. Once they were in the car, and the car was in motion, the driver would say to them, "Oh, by the way, you hope you don't mind, but we do first have to go past the psychiatric hospital," mentioning the name of this famous institution and formidable institution, to drop off our other passenger. The couple would nervously agree, of course, to this, since they were getting a ride home, and otherwise they'd have to walk long distances. We'd set off slowly, and then all of a sudden, Dr. Azimuth, me, would croak, "Drive faster," at which Robert would put his foot down a little, and the car would lurch into about 35 miles an hour. "Faster, faster!" The car would then start speeding up, and you could be sure that the couple would be out at the next red light. They never stayed in the car, but very often dropped off miles from their home. It was probably a terrible thing to do to these people. It was a very frightening experience, but once they'd gone, we would collapse with laughter. I would, of course, turn around and they would see the terrible face of Dr. Azimuth.
It's extraordinarily funny, and you're right.
It's funny to do, less funny to relate.
Well, and also, no, it's very good to relate, but it's frightening to have experienced. And we asked Nick Garland about you and embarrassment. Now, Nick, of course, worked with you on the Barry Mackenzie.
Of course he did. He created the look of Barry Mackenzie.
A great political cartoonist. And this is Nick on Barry Humphries.
I have a friend who maintains that all the people who have tried to identify what it is that motivates human beings to get through life, Freud famously talking about a sexual drive, or others a drive for power or money or all sorts of things. My friend maintains what really drives people is a relentless attempt to avoid small, embarrassing confrontations. People will do almost anything to avoid this. They will give money to con men, or they will not turn up for work, or they will leave the country, or do anything. They don't want small, embarrassing confrontations. Barry has made a career out of precipitating people into as embarrassing confrontations as he can possibly manufacture. And he really does it, and I've seen him do it. Anybody who is unembarrassable is immensely powerful. I sometimes think that some politicians have this quality, very, very thick skins, like Mrs. Thatcher had it. She didn't really mind. She liked confrontation. She'd cross the street for a fight. It gave her a tremendous amount of power. And I think that's both Dame Edna's strength and it is Barry's great strength. And it's what makes both of them very dangerous. I once heard Barry, being Edna, being interviewed about the man who was the producer of his show. This was somebody who he was working closely with and relied on very much. And yet he was also quarrelling with him, some detail of the contract. And Edna just began slagging this guy off, just saying he's a complete crook, he's a shyster, he's a terrible man, he's doing this and that. And later I saw Barry and I said, Barry, how could you say all those things, for God's sake? You're going to have to get on with this guy. He said, I know. I heard her saying them. And I thought, God, why are you saying this? This is going to be so embarrassing. But as if he sort of tucked himself in behind her. He knew perfectly well what he was doing. But he's drawn towards these things. And if they're not happening, he makes them happen.
You lack the embarrassment gene.
Well, I, in fact, have suffered embarrassment as much as any of us. But I do feel that there is great entertainment value in embarrassment and in kind of wrong-footing the human race in some sort of way. We make all kinds of discoveries that way. When people come to the theatre, they like to feel very secure. Once they're seated, the curtain goes up and a spectacle is presented to them, which does not uncomfortably impinge upon them. I really try to break down that old, safe relationship between the show and its spectators. And I succeeded in doing it in all kinds of ways. And I began to do it instinctively when I was a young student, before I thought that I would become an actor of any kind.
There is a great phrase of one of the earliest Dadaists who spoke of Dada as being the public execution of a false morality, which I think is a wonderful phrase.
Yes, yes.
The public execution of a false
Who was
morality.
that?
This is Hugo Ball.
Oh, Hugo Ball.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Okay, now that's what you're about. You execute people.
Well, perhaps I do. Of course, you're obliging me to look at myself in a new way here in this discussion. Naturally, I prefer to think of myself as a genial figure, as an entertainer who finally sends everyone out very happy and rosy. But perhaps, in a sense, there is a brutality in my work that I've not fully recognized. It is true, as Nicholas Garland says, that Edna sometimes says what I decline to say. She is a mouthpiece for me, and yet I deplore some of the things that come out of it. In that sense, I guess it's a strange ambivalence that I project. But it's fun, above all, and it's satisfying to me that I've found this way of living. It's not just a way of acting or performing, it is actually a way of surviving. And that's something you were talking about a little earlier, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, it is the conscientious objector, the false morality, because this is Melbourne that you grew up in. Of course, my experience of Melbourne is partly through listening to Edna or reading Humphries, so its accuracy I never know. But it is a false morality she and you flay, isn't it?
Yes, it is. It is, and it's finally, I suppose, niceness was the thing. It was my mother's favourite word. People were nice or they weren't. Words were nice. I mean, even to describe the backyard as the backyard was not quite nice. it was the back garden. There's a substance called Vegemite, which people spread on their toast, which has latterly become almost fashionable. And my mother said, "I'd rather you used Marmite," she said to me once. "I don't think Vegemite is quite nice. It's a bit Sydney," she would add. It was these suburban snobberies which appalled me and intrigued me.
The Dadaist, which I want to stay with for a moment, also led you into a kind of musical area. I mean, music is a passion of yours.
Yes.
And we have a piece from the Maloof Concerto, which I have to say you have introduced me to. It's not a
Oh, I see.
piece before, so we should listen to some of that.
We now present the
Maloof Concerto.
played by the Wubbophonic Chamber Ensemble. This work is in 3 movements.
Allegro, il penseroso, grosso.
As I listened even to those few bars, very distorted and poorly recorded, I was exploding with inner laughter, because it caused such tremendous offence to people when we did these performances on stage. I, in a way, miss those moments of alienation that we enjoyed in those far-off days. But of course now people buy tickets to see me, and I don't want to give them their money back.
You noticed before we began this conversation that I brought a volume of Robert Frost with me.
I noticed that.
When I first saw you in the 70s, given the person I am, a Robert Frost poem popped into my
Really?
head, and it's this. It's called Fire and Ice. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favour fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Now, Humphries, in the end, likes that alienation. He loves the ice, doesn't he?
Well, I was reminded really of something, of this Graham Greene story. Shirley Hazzard, who's an Australian author of the very good novel, I think, The Transit of Venus, and it was Greene who said to her, and I paraphrase a little, because this is just from memory, he said, well, all writers have to have a sliver of ice in their hearts. And she said, and Graham, yours is just the tip of the iceberg. Very good, wasn't it? You have to harden your heart a little, even just to overcome stage fright. I still experience a very human terror before appearing in public, even to a lesser degree before appearing at a microphone or in front of a camera. Walking out there onto that stage is helped, of course, by the heavy disguises which I cover myself with, and so I'm very rarely up there as myself. And if I am, it's an invented self. Just as I reinvented Melbourne, and Melbourne became a mythical place like Trollope's Barchester, but firmly based on a real place that long ago I couldn't stand. So it really began in anger, a kind of icy rage.
I was going to say, given the anger and rage you felt towards that world, and that still erupts in these books, how did Humphries stop the anger turning on himself? Or did he?
I'm not sure. I did have a long self-destructive period in my life when I alleviated my very, very troubled emotional self with a popular drug, alcohol. And when I stopped drinking 32 years ago, I began a very slow process of regeneration and adjustment to the world as it is. I think until then I either wished to change it or to ignore it. And I suppose even in my early work there was an intention to edify in some vague way, to change things. I learned better. And now I just have the habit of performance. I'm not at all sure that I will ever do as well in my work as I did in the early days. I think it's reached a stage where I tend to be repeating myself slightly. I'm starting to write a new show. I'm getting a few quite good ideas for new characters. But the old passion is not quite there.
Can we pick you up on these characters? Because Nick Garland, from whom we've already had, the political cartoonist, remembers with immense affection the repertory company of characters that you once had.
At a certain point, Edna became so popular, and Barry really focused his work on that character. I mean, Edna was only one of many characters when I first knew Barry. In fact, she makes a walk-on in Barry Mackenzie, and he had many different characters, and she was just one of them. But at one point, she became the character with her strange Les Patterson, sort of male Australian character that sort of accompanies her in some funny sort of way, sort of shadows her. And those two became what Barry did, to the exclusion of many other things that he might have done. I rather miss some of the other characters that he might have developed. I was always a terrific fan of Sandy Stone, that strange, ghostly, drawling figure who actually was dead by the time Barry stopped doing him, but still speaking, his ghostly voice from the other side. I thought that was the most brilliant character, and I just loved it, always loved him. And I loved Barry doing it, and I loved the risks he took to hold a whole theatre full of people while he just sort of murmured on this drivel that this guy talked. It was a tremendous sort of theatre. That I thought he was just superb. And I liked several of the other characters. There was one who was a trade union leader called Lance Boyle, who was always getting terribly angry with his son, who was called Damien. And there was another character who used to throw parties to which nobody came, or they did come, they almost immediately left. And Barry did something very strange with these characters. They weren't like ordinary cabaret sketches. They were almost like one-act plays, and because nothing happened in them, really, I hope it doesn't sound too sort of pretentious, but they had a kind of Chekhovian quality. They seemed to be about life, extremely touching, as well as very funny, tremendously entertaining, gripping theatre.
Of course, Nick Garland is right. The vaudeville took over, though since he's not seen any of my Australian shows in recent years, he's not to know that Sandy Stone is still in my repertoire. In fact, I never do a show in Australia without a long monologue of Sandy's. It's certainly the character I enjoy doing most of all.
You were in the first Australian version of a performance of Waiting for Godot.
Yes.
And when I think of Sandy Stone, I think of, Ham in Beckett's Endgame, one of these paterfamilias endlessly rabbiting on about the failure of their kids and the failure of women and their lives, or a Pinter character. I mean, did Pinter and Beckett and those kinds of characters, or Chekhov, to quote Garland, did they figure in your imagination when you were
No, they,
bringing them
as a
up?
matter of fact, didn't, because I invented Sandy before I'd read Beckett. Sandy was created sometime in about 1956, and I'd not come across Beckett until the following year, when I found in a second-hand bookstore a copy of More Pricks Than Kicks. He's novel of 1934.
It would be worth a very large amount of money.
Four
that.
and six it cost me, but it's worth about £4,500 now.
Now, you are a bibliophile. You're a great collector of art. You're a passionate admirer of music. Are all those things to the side of your creativity, or do they feed it? Because reading the book, I hadn't quite realised your passion for the late 19th century.
Well, they sort of get in the way of it a bit. My life has become so itinerant, especially with these American tours, that I go to a bookstore, I buy something, post it off rather forlornly, and wonder when I'm going to see it again. So there is that part of my nature which is vagabond, and another part of my nature which is kind of sitting at home in a very overcrowded library.
But the books that Humphries likes, these great late 19th century, and you like much more than that, but these great 19th century culture, seems to me far removed from the Humphries who's invented stone or thought of
It is.
Average.
Yes,
and that's a kind of schizophrenia I don't get.
No, well, neither do I, really. I'm very puzzled by it. Even more puzzled than when I should be asked about it in this way. But it's just something that's happened to me. When I think, for example, of the 90s, which still interests me very much, from those early readings of that Holbrook Jackson book, and I'm still pursuing minor works by the most obscure figures of that period, figures who aren't generally known even to scholars of that epoch. And some of the verse isn't all that good. But these were poets writing sometimes in homage to Swinburne, and many too indebted to Verlaine and to French decadent models, were a group that I still have an enormous sympathy for. The paintings of Conder, for example, always interested me. The colourist to Beardsley's Draftsman. He was a bit of a hit-and-miss artist, rather patchy, died of syphilis in the early 20th century, left an enormous amount of work, some of which I own. And that period still has its fascination for me, and it's so different, really, from the other books on my shelves, which tend to be street directories to Melbourne cities.
You've mentioned Condor. Who's the poet, as it were, who's as important to you as Condor is?
I suppose Ernest Dowson, or someone like Theodore Wratislaw, or...
So you really, that identification with the aesthete, it partly explains your loathing, which I don't quite understand, but your loathing of sport. Because, you know, in Britain you could be an aesthete or a hearty. Boy, were you an aesthete.
I preferred to be an aesthete, and I noticed that the old Dadaists were too. Tristan Tzara certainly was, with his monocle and his stylized personality. And I guess these were people I looked to for models, and I saw links, you see, between the Dadaists and indeed the late 19th century aesthetes in England.
And when you arrived in London and you got involved with Private Eye, did you see those as late Dadaists?
No, I didn't. I was, in a sense, slightly disappointed by the Private Eye group, probably because I wasn't the centre of attention, and Peter Cook was, and everything he said made them howl with laughter, and I stood sort of rather resentfully on the periphery of all of this, but was grateful that, thanks to Cook's advocacy, Garland and I were able to push the Barry Mackenzie comic strip forward, often with the disapproval of Richard Ingram's, who was very much a head prefect figure.
I was going to say, because you must have felt at one level you were back in Melbourne Grammar School, because Private Eye was full of English public school
It
boys.
felt like school. The office smelt like a prefect's study. But nonetheless, it was really thanks to Peter Cook that I got a look in, as it were, at the tail end of the legendary satire, so-called satire movement.
Even when you were settled in London in the 60s, did you feel an itinerant?
Yes, I did a little. I'd never felt really accepted.
Why was that?
I really don't know. I just think that I just felt that what I did best, which was about Australia, was not ever going to work in England.
You're
And
like
so-
Joyce, aren't you? Joyce spends all of his life outside Dublin writing about the damn place.
With the Dublin street directory in his pocket. There he is in Trieste, with the street directory of Dublin there. I felt exiled. I couldn't stand the idea of living in Australia, except for very brief episodes. Of course, when I went back and did my shows, I was the toast of the town. My one-man shows became more and more successful through the 60s as I sort of sank into despair and started drinking very, very heavily in London. It was only really when we made a film of Barry Mackenzie in the early 70s and I started appearing on talk shows like Michael Parkinson and Russell Harty that I suddenly felt a surge of confidence that I actually was funny in England. That's why the show that you first saw in 1975 at the Apollo Theatre worked, because I was funny again.
And that funniness seems to me, as you describe your relationship to Australia and Britain, to do with the you're unanchored. You've got an odd way. The part of the Australia of the past you don't like. You certainly don't like the Puritan Australian of the present.
No, I don't.
You know, you didn't like, or you were only half like the London of the 60s, but you have nowhere to go. I mean, Humphries is endlessly going to places, but he's never at home, to quote Rilke.
Well, I'm glad one of us has quoted Rilke. I couldn't stand, of course, the Philistinism of Australia in the old days. And now it's espoused the arts, or as Les spells them, the YARTZs. I like it even less, if you know what I mean.
But you need to like places less.
I need to like them less, perhaps. You know, I was saying that I wasn't funny in England in the 60s. Or sporadically I was funny, of course, and when I had the release of the comic strip, it was very important for me, because I could invent an absurd Australian who wasn't even based on a real person, like my stage characters. Didn't have to be convincing. I invented a language for him. But in the early 60s, Cook put me on stage at his establishment club, where I'd had a terrible failure. I tried to do my regional monologues in the presence of an audience who were used to Harold Macmillan impersonations and brilliant dialogues between John Fortune and John Bird and Eleanor Bron too. And I was very old-fashioned, I felt, by comparison.
It really was painful for you, isn't it? It's clear as you talk. It was a very painful
Very.
moment.
Yes, it was awful.
Didn't you think of getting back on the boat or the plane?
No, I didn't. No.
We finally will get to Edna, because we need to get to Edna, and we're going to do so via John Lahr, who's both a friend of yours and written a very fine book about you. He's very interesting on Edna and on what laughter's about.
Dame Edna is a mockery of maternal love, of caring of any kind. So in that sense, I do think, even though Barry may disown any sort of autobiographical connection between the character and his mother, I think that the comedy doesn't work that way. It obviously has a deep psychological and autobiographical connection to him. He tells me that he brought his firstborn child back to home to show his mother, and as he came up the path to his house and greeted her, she said, "Shh, you're on the air. They're talking about you." And it was someone on Australian television talking about, as they frequently do, how Dame Edna was a very poor export for Australia, was bringing shame and odium on the Australians. And Barry was so incensed. Here he brought his firstborn, and his mother was listening to a radio program. He went into the other room and called up the radio show. It was a talking show, and got on the air and in Dame Edna's voice and said, I just like I'd like to agree with Mrs. Humphries that Barry Humphries is absolutely sort of a disgrace and one of Australia's great shames, or something to that effect. So, I mean, getting her attention, mocking the world of the uninquisitive aspect of her and the sort of judgmental quality based on not very much information. I think that's very much part of his comic attack, and he can disown any autobiography about it. But I mean, you know, the whole business of great comedy is getting even. Revenge is the central motive of all great comedy.
As Lars says, is she your getting even with the maternal and with the Australian?
Well, you know, I have to, in a sense, I mean, who knows? It's for the commentator and the critic to talk about revenge. Indeed, to discuss my motives in doing these things. A lot of what I do is rather instinctive. You know, it may well be therapeutic for me not to know. The women, and even some of the men who come on stage at the end of the show and make a little tableau, all end up embracing Edna and deeply submerged within this horrendous woman. I hear whispered protestations of love and affection. Someone said it only the other night in St. Louis to Dame Edna. Very loudly, a young man leapt to his feet and called out, "We love you, Edna." And there was quite a long pause, and Edna said, "Well, I don't love you. Call me old-fashioned, but I don't. If I knew you, I might quite like you, though I even doubt that."
Barry, we're now going to hear from one of your sternest critics.
It was a lovely warm friendship, and it lasted a long time, and it's still there, you know, but business, you know, I'm sorry, but the old pounds, shillings and pence, they change things a bit. I think it's a pity, really. It's not me. I'm no different. But I think he is, you know, he's got used to some of the little luxuries that my talent has bought for him.
Entirely true?
No, I don't. Well, no, not entirely true, I don't think. Because my experience with the luxuries is checkered.
Edna has been with you since 1956.
55, really, the first Edna piece was written. So that's a long time, nearly half a century.
You never thought of killing her?
From time to time, I've thought I've reached a kind of dead end.
What's Humphries' own epitaph on his own
headstone? Oh, my epitaph. An epitaph. My God. Does an epitaph sum up a life? Or is it a final apology? Is it a disclaimer? You like to spring this on people, don't you?
Of course.
You do. This is your method.
This is the nearest I get to being Edna Everage.
I see. No, you're not embarrassing me. I just want to come up with something that's truthful. You know what I mean? Well, it's Sandy Stone had it, in a sense, my epitaph too. So, at the point when Sandy died, he wrote on his wardrobe before collapsing, "We are not all dead." And rather defiantly he wrote it. And perhaps that might be mine, you know. I am not necessarily dead.
Barry Humphries, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Tonight's Nightwaves was presented by Philip Dodd, and the producer was Ariane Cook.